And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing a couple of lows moving northward here along the west coast and the front right just to the east there, and a very tight gradient here across southern Alaska up to the Alaska Range due to the big area high pressure over Canada there. And so a high wind warning out for Anchorage, Palmer, Matanuska Valley areas, especially the higher elevations, for gusts of 75 miles per hour. Alaska Range, same thing, high wind warning out, gusts 75 miles an hour. Winter storm warnings out from the Yukon Delta northward into the Kobuk Valley and Noatak Valley areas for heavy snow and blowing snow, reducing visibilities down to a quarter mile there. And just much lighter winds in areas of light snow and snow showers for the Bering Sea down to portions of the Aleutians. And then for Tuesday, main low now up around the Seward Peninsula, slowly weakening as it tracks northward, the front edging ever so slowly eastward, being held back by high pressure over the Northwest Territories. That keeps a pretty good gradient across southern Alaska here, especially from western Prince William Sound in toward the western Alaska Range. So a windy day coming up with a high wind warning, probably coming down later tomorrow afternoon for the Anchorage Palmer area, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. It stays dry over the eastern interior. Snow becoming mixed here, Kuskokwim Valley into Bristol Bay. Just rain there for Kodiak Island, southern Kenai Peninsula. Sunshine, light winds for the Panhandle. That really holds into Wednesday as well. There'll be variable clouds around there. But high pressure developing over Norton Sound will dry it out with much lighter winds here over the western part of the state as that low kicks way off into the Arctic there. Another warm front bringing some mixed precipitation into Bristol Bay with light rain for Kodiak Island. And rain and snow showers Alaska Peninsula become just plain snow showers for the eastern Aleutians, but dry for the central Aleutians. And for the coastal water forecast, along the south coast, look for northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. East winds on the central coast at 15 knots. And for the north coast, east-northeast 15 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage for Tuesday, north winds at 20 knots. Clarence Strait, north at 15. And then for Wednesday, Clarence Strait, north winds 20 knots. Windier day coming up for the inner channels here, getting a little brisk out of the north at 30 knots for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal. Small craft advisories here along the coast, central and south coast, east winds 25 knots. North coast winds lighter, but still out of the east, but only at 15 knots. Prince William Sound, east winds 25 knots tomorrow. North Gulf Coast, east winds 30 knots. And gale warnings for the Barren Islands. Southeast winds 45 knots, full gales for Kamishak Bay. Southeast 45 knots there. Small craft advisory, southern Cook Inlet, east winds at 30 knots, east at 15 for northern Cook Inlet. And for the day on Wednesday, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay out of the east at 40 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast here, east winds 20 to 30 knots and east at 15 for Prince William Sound. And for Kodiak Island tomorrow, southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. Southeast 30 or 25 knot winds for Bristol Bay. And it looks like northwest winds at 15 to 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And then for the peninsula on Wednesday, we've got north to northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Northeast at 20 for Bristol Bay. And Kodiak Island, east winds 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, north to northwest winds at about 15 knots. North winds 15 for Adak and Atka. And the western Aleutians, variable winds 10 to 20 knots. And for Wednesday, western Aleutians here, south or southwest winds 15 to 25 knots. East to northeast winds for Adak and Atka at about 15 knots. And then those winds increase as you head over toward Unalaska Island. Then you're looking at gales at 35 knots from the north. For the southwest coast, Tuesday, south of Nunivak Island, southwest winds at about 15 knots, west at 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast. And for St. Lawrence Island, west winds 25 knots, but southeast at 30 knots for Norton Sound, and south or northwest winds at 20 knots, St. Matthew Island, 15 knots out of the northwest for the Pribilofs. And then for the day on Wednesday, St. Paul and St. George, look for north winds at about 20 knots, but South winds 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. Yukon Delta coast winds northwest at 20, north 25 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, 15-knot winds for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds at 20 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the Central Coast, east winds 25 knots. Northeast at 25 for the Western Arctic coast. Gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea, east winds 35 knots. Those swing around to the south, drop off to 20 to 30 knots here for the Chukchi Sea on Wednesday. Western Arctic coast, brisk wind advisories, southwest at 30 knots. And for the central and eastern coastline, look for south winds at 15 to 20 knots.